So good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Kurzweil-Kielberger, and on behalf of all of us here at the We Global Learning Center, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this exciting event tonight. I first learned about Barbara-Arrowsmith Young, the founder of the Arrowsmith Program, from our dear family friends who had experienced the transformative impacts of her program firsthand. So since then, I became fascinated by her truly pioneering program and have been very excited to follow the body of evidence behind her work. So as many of you know, Barbara is an international best-selling author. She's widely recognized for her extraordinary contribution to the field of education. Just this past year, being the recipient of the 2019 Leaders and Legends Innovation Award from OISE at the University of Toronto. And as the director of the Arrowsmith School and Arrowsmith Program, she continues to develop programs for students with specific learning difficulties so that students may come to experience the joy of learning. Truly, Barbara is a legend here in Toronto, and now her work is celebrated around the world, so implemented in over 100 organizations across Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, and Asia. So as Barbara created one of the first adaptations utilizing the principles of neuroplasticity to overcome learning disabilities, I know that we are all excited to hear more about her journey of discovery, the various fields of research she's brought together in her program, and the incredible outcomes she's achieved over the last 40 years. So please join me in welcoming the extraordinary Barbara-Arrowsmith Young.
Thank you, and thank you, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. Thank you. I'm not so sure I want to be a legend, but this just reminds me, a number of years ago, one of the students in the program, when it was in the Toronto Catholic District School Board, figured that anybody that had invented something had to be dead. So he asked the teacher if they could come and put flowers on my grave. It was a little premature. So I just want to thank all the people that we've worked with here at the We organization for their incredible support and expertise to provide the opportunity tonight for me to speak about what I'm most passionate about, which is the human brain and its incredible capacity for change. So thank you, and to everybody that's been part of this event. And my life has been a journey of exploration, exploring the territory of the human brain, and really trying to understand how it makes us uniquely who we are. So our brain does shape us. It shapes our perceptions and understanding of ourselves, of other people, and of the world and our relationship to that. So incredibly profound, and we can't really escape it. It goes with us everywhere we go. And I'm hoping by the end of the talk tonight that we start to look at behavior through what I call a cognitive lens. We often look at somebody's behavior and sometimes attribute it to negative personality traits. So that person's just being difficult, or they're being rude, or not doing what I asked them to do. And it just may be a cognitive difficulty that they're doing the best they can, and that's how they see the world and how they can engage in the world. And I think if we can understand the territory of the brain, we can have more compassion for ourselves and compassion for other people. So tonight I want to take you on a journey. It's a very personal journey of my story and my exploration. And it's also a universal story in that each and every one of us, has a brain. And as I said, it shapes who we are. So where did I begin? I started in many years ago, I'm not going to date myself, in what I call the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. So when I started grade 1 in Peterborough, that's where I grew up, the belief was your brain was fixed, right? If there was a problem, a learning difficulty, really there was not much you could do about it. You had to learn to accept and live within your limitations. So in grade 1, my teacher, I overheard her talking to my parents saying I had a mental block, because at that time there wasn't even the term learning disability. It didn't exist in the vernacular. So being quite literal as a child, I actually thought I had a piece of wood in my head. I had a mental block, a cube, that was making learning difficult. Well, later I was to learn that no, I didn't have a piece of wood in my head, but I had blockages. I had parts of my brain that weren't performing the way they were designed to, which made learning difficult. So I really felt in grade 1 I was given a life sentence. The teacher told my parents that all of my education would be a struggle, which it definitely was a struggle, but not to have high expectations for me, because I wouldn't necessarily amount to much. So I feel like in grade 1, I was given this sentence to a life of struggle with really no possibility of change. And I had multiple learning disabilities, so not just one. So I struggled with understanding language. It was almost like if you imagine a translator, I could hear the words, but my brain couldn't really translate them into meaning. If it was really concrete, like it's snowing outside, I could understand that because I could draw a picture or an image in my head of that. But as soon as it got complex or relational or abstract, I couldn't understand it. So things like number, I could understand, if I lined up 4 objects, I could understand, okay, those are 4 things. But as soon as you put the, fractions, so a relationship, so 1 part out of 4, it meant nothing to me. So I couldn't understand fractions. Making decisions was really hard, because when you make a decision, you have to weigh and compare and contrast alternatives. I couldn't do that. So it was really a struggle. Even things like above, below, before, after, those kind of concepts, because they're relational, didn't make sense to me. So all my notebooks were filled with pictures. I would draw pictures or diagrams to try to map language onto the right hemisphere, because my left hemisphere didn't really understand it. There was no cause and effect in my world, so I didn't understand why things happened. I didn't have insight into things. I got labeled very early in schooling as being rigid and stubborn, and truly I was, because for me, if I came to grasp something, to understand it, I would hold on for dear life, because it was so hard won. And then if somebody kindly over here said, well, consider this, I'd have to let go of this to integrate this other piece of information. And it actually felt like a physical assault. I could not do that. So I would dig my heels in, and I was stubborn, but it came again from a cognitive place, not an emotional place. I didn't understand jokes, because I didn't understand irony. So I would I would match my laughter to, the amount that other people were laughing, because I didn't want to be left out. So that was one area of difficulty that I had. I also had problems with registering sensation on the left side of my body. So the part of the brain that maps sensation wasn't working properly. So I was really clumsy and awkward, and getting into lots of accidents. And I was the last person that anybody wanted on a sports team, because if a ball was coming at me, I'd want to avoid it rather than trying to catch it. So poor at sports, and even something as simple as crossing a street was hard for me, because when you cross a street, you kind of figure out where you are in relation to those cars, and I had difficulty. So I would walk blocks out of my way to cross at a stop sign or street lights where I knew I would be safe. And then I had problems representing 3-dimensional space in my head. So things like geometry, geography were really, really difficult. I would get lost in people's homes because I couldn't create a mental map. Organic chemistry in university was really hard, because you have to construct those molecules. Something like IKEA was really difficult. Anything where you had to build something go from 2 dimensions into 3 dimensions, because there was no 3-dimensional space in my brain. So over time, what happened was a very kind of fractured sense of myself that led to feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety. My life felt like there was a series of puzzle pieces that never quite fit together to make sense. So I began to view myself early in my schooling as stupid, as bad, as not really a good person. I internalized, a lot of those feelings. And every day I valiantly went out of the door of my house, and actually my school was right across the street. And not with excitement or joy, but with trepidation, because I knew whatever was going to meet me in that classroom was going to be a struggle. And I did have some strengths. I had a verbatim auditory memory and a visual memory. So basically I got through most of my schooling by memorizing everything. And then when I would see the exam, I would flip through my memory to find the page that I thought would answer that question. And sometimes I would get 100% because I made a really good match. And sometimes I would get 10% because I made a really bad match because I didn't understand the question. And my teachers would conclude that I had not worked hard for that 10%. Well, I worked equally hard for the 10% as I did for the 100%. It's just I misunderstood the question. So this was my experience going through school. And I had a mother actually who won an award in the province of Ontario for her contributions to education. So came from sort of that background. And my father was a scientist and an inventor. And he had this belief that he instilled in me. He said, if there's a problem and there's no solution, he said, it's your responsibility to go out and find a solution. So he set me on a quest. I had no idea how I was going to do that. And I was getting lost all the time. But I figured there must be a solution out there, or there must be something that can help me. And so for me, the solution to my difficulties came through 2 lines of research. And this is the foundation of the work that we do at Arrowsmith. So Alexander Luria, a brilliant Russian neuropsychologist, he was studying people after World War II in Russia that have very localized head wounds. And what he would do is say, okay, there's damage to this part of the brain. What can the person no longer do? Therefore, what is the job of that part of the brain? And to solve a problem, first you have to understand its nature. And he wrote this book, The Man with the Shattered World, and someone handed that to me in 1977, which changed my life. And in this book, it told the story of a Russian soldier who in 1944 at the Battle of Smolensk had a very localized head wound. And so the book was Zizetsky's journal describing all his challenges, and then Luria interpreting what was going on in the brain of this individual. And as I read Zizetsky's journal, I thought, we're living parallel lives. The things that he could no longer do after the wound were things I had not been able to do from birth. And we talked about, both of us in our journals, how meaning was ephemeral and it would just disappear into a mist. No matter how hard we tried to hold on to it, we couldn't grasp meaning. He had been studying mathematics before his injury. Afterwards, he couldn't understand fractions. He couldn't understand relational concepts. So now I knew my problem was part of my brain wasn't working the way it should be. I knew I didn't have a piece of shrapnel in my head, but for some reason, my brain wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing. So then the next piece, what do I do about that, came out of Mark Rosenzweig's work at Berkeley. And he was one of the people studying this concept of neuroplasticity, which simply means your brain is capable of change at a physiological and functional level as a result of input and stimulation. And he was working with rats, and he would put a group in cages with lots of toys to play with, and he'd put another group in with not much to do. And what he found was the group of rats with a lot of stimulation were more able to learn mazes, so more intelligent as rats can be. And then afterwards, what he did is he looked at their brains, and he saw that the brains had changed physiologically in those rats that had had stimulation. And you can see a picture here of the nerve cells. There were more dendrites, so more branching on the neurons, which allows more synaptic connections, so better neurotransmission. There were more neurotransmitters, more glia cells, and large capillaries. So the brains had changed as a result of the stimulation, which led to better learning. And at that time, this was in 1977, I thought, well, if rats have neuroplasticity, surely humans must have neuroplasticity. And the belief at that point was, again, this pre-neuroplastic paradigm. Most of the people I spoke to said, well, we know the brain is fixed at about age 10 or 11. So, I was now 26. There's not much you can do. But I was determined to try and see whether I could change my own brain. So I set out at that point to see if I could understand the nature of the difficulty. I'm not sure, there's a bit of feedback. could I create an exercise or an activity or a task like those rats to stimulate that part of my brain? And I figured, what did I have to lose but time? And at that point, I still couldn't read an analog clock, because to read a clock, you have to see relationships. So I figured, I'm just going to lose time, and I can't tell time. So why not try? So I created 3 very different exercises, because the nature of this work is, if you're going to improve a cognitive function, you have to understand the nature of the function to develop a task or an activity that's going to work that function. It's kind of like physiotherapy in a sense. Like, if you're going to work this muscle here because it's damaged, you're not going to be exercising over here. So what I did is I went back into Luria's work, trying to understand my difficulties and see what I could do. So the first area I targeted was that part of the brain that receives input both from the external world, but also from internally, to attach meaning to it. And Luria talks about this area as an association of association areas, because it integrates multiple stimuli to say, aha, that's what this means. So one of the ways to think about this area is, if you think about the palm of your hand is a concept or an idea, and your fingers are all the elements that have to come together in a synthesis to say, aha, that's what this means. And if there's a difficulty here, like I had, or Zizetsky, these pieces don't come together, or they kind of come together, but it's shaky, and then they disintegrate again. So you might be able to learn a concept, for a short period of time, but it falls apart. And so my experience was all these unconnected, disconnected, unrelated elements. So I created the first exercise, and what did I pick? I picked clocks. So I designed an exercise with clocks, not that I wanted to get better at telling time, but I wanted to force my brain to process relationships. And if anybody's been to the school, and I welcome anybody that wants to come and visit, you can see we have levels of this exercise, from actually a one-handed clock all the way up to a 10-handed clock. And the only 2 people that have ever walked into the school and been able to interpret the 10-handed clocks was a physicist from Harvard and an astronomer who had been involved in discovering radio-emitting galaxies. So I figured I'm onto something. So the idea is, if there's a difficulty, start where the difficulty is, and step by step build that function, and if we can, bring it to an above average. So you're putting a strength into an area where there's a difficulty. So as I worked through that exercise, and I kept adding more complexity to make it more of a load on my brain to process relationships. And I got up to a certain point, which is what we call like seeing 4 connections on this clock. That's when I knew there was human neuroplasticity. It was my life significantly changed. I could now live in what I call real time, whereas before I lived in what I called lag time. I would listen to a conversation, and because I had an auditory verbatim memory, I would memorize the conversation. I would walk away, and maybe 2 hours later, I'd say, oh, that's what that person said. But they hadn't hung around for 2 hours to wait for me to understand. Now I could listen, I could understand, I could make a comment, I could understand their comment back. For the first time, I was part of human discourse. It was profound. I could also now read, complex material and actually understand it as I read it, whereas before I might have to read that page 10, 20, 30 times and constantly being hypothesizing what it meant, but never being certain. And that's what Luria talked about. Somebody with this difficulty at the level I had, it could never verify meaning. Now I could verify meaning. And it was so much more efficient, because I could read something and read the next page and the next page and put it all together. I also went back and taught myself all of mathematics, starting at grade 1 all the way up to college. And now I could understand it rather than just memorizing formulas and plugging numbers in, but actually understanding it from the logic and first principles. And as a side, I've worked with, psychiatrists who have had clients that have this difficulty. And if this difficulty is in place, it's really hard to benefit from insight there, because you can't make those connections and cause and effect. These individuals come into the program, work through this exercise, and at a certain point, they can benefit from therapy, because they can make connections, and they can do that aha and have insight and understand their behavior. So that was that one area. Then I thought, okay, that worked. So let me create an exercise for the part of my body that doesn't register sensation, because now I was driving a car. So imagine if I didn't know where the left side of my body was, I didn't know where the left side of that car was. And it was my parents' car initially. So I'd bring it home with some dints on the down like that. Okay. Okay, some dents on the left side of the car. And I'd had like also a number of accidents because, I was accident prone because I didn't know where that left side of my body was. So I created an exercise for that, which had to do with my eyes closed to get sensory feedback. And now I can register sensation. I know where that left side of my body is. I don't dent my car, and I can actually play sports. So that area had changed with a very different exercise. And then I decided to address the spatial part. And now I can build IKEA furniture. And I can sew, from a pattern into, creating something in 3 dimensions. But really interesting, there can be a hereditary component to these difficulties. My mother and I shared this spatial difficulty. And as a child, we'd get in the car, she'd be driving, and we knew where we were starting and we knew where we wanted to end, but it was like a black hole in between. There were no maps in either of our heads. And she had a really good attitude. She said, it'll be an adventure. We'll get there eventually, which we always did, but never quite the same way twice. But as I understood these functions more as an adult, I asked her whether it ever impacted her in, her career or decision that she made. And she shared with me that she'd gone to the University of Manitoba wanting to be a chemist, right? And in her first year, she was gently counseled out of chemistry, and she went into home economics because having the spatial difficulty, she couldn't do the construction that was required in chemistry. I have 4 brothers, and one of my brothers has this difficulty as well, not to the extent that my mother and I did. So we're sort of we're at the extreme end of the continuum. He was probably mild. So he did become a chemist at the University of Toronto, but he went into physical chemistry because it places less of a load. So what I've learned over doing this work is, that there are these multiple cognitive functions that come together in activities that we do, and every single one is critical, and we all have our own unique profiles. So these are some of the cognitive functions that we work with, and currently we can address 19 different functions. And I'm very clear that's not everything that can be impacted by learning, but is a broad range. So, difficulty reading nonverbal cues, auditory memory. So the person, you probably have met the person that, puts Post-it notes up everywhere because they can't remember if they don't write it down, or you send them to the grocery store with 5 things to buy and they come back with 3 and forget the other 2, or the child that comes home and knows they have homework, but they really can't remember, exactly what that homework is, or somebody with this difficulty, doesn't like books on tape because, they don't learn auditorily. Or the numeracy quantification sense, the ability to hold and operate on numbers, not just to learn your math facts, but also to have a sense of, how much gas do I need to get a certain distance? So anything related to quantification. I had an opera singer that had this difficulty, and time signature in music is related to this. So all of these different functions, if there's a difficulty, will have an impact on the person's learning in a very characteristic way, depending on the nature of that function. So every one of us has our own unique profile. Like, nobody has everything at a strong level. At least so far I haven't met anybody that does. So we all have our unique strengths and weaknesses. And if we know ourselves, we know, I'm good at certain things and not as good at others. But what happens when there's a learning difficulty is there's kind of a pileup of a number of these areas that make learning difficult. And if people are interested, on our website, there's I think it's about a 230 questionnaire that you can go through and answer these questions, and it will come up with saying, based on your responses, you may have a difficulty in this area. And one of the things I'm passionate is, we have labels in the field: dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia. And I say we have to go under the labels to target the functions, because you can see 5 children identified as dyslexic, and each one will have their own unique cognitive profile of the different strengths and weaknesses in those functions. So we're not addressing the label, we're addressing the functions under that label. And then this concept of cognitive mismatch, I mean, we work with a lot of adults as well. And this is the idea that there's no part of your brain that's irrelevant. It just isn't designed that way. So, there's sometimes where a person is in a job or a profession that isn't quite a match to their cognitive profile. So I'll give you an example of a pilot that I worked with a number of years ago, and he had that auditory memory problem. So his strategy was to get the air traffic controller to repeat the instructions multiple times so he would be able to remember them because he couldn't retain them the first time he was saying it. So my joke with him was, if I was getting on an airplane, I want to know what airspace he was flying in and I would avoid it. The better strategy was we addressed and strengthened that cognitive function for him so then he could listen once and retain it. I worked with a person he was a butcher, and imagine he had that same problem of not knowing where one side of his body was in space. So his job was, you got a really sharp knife in this hand and you don't know where this hand is. And so the first day I met him, this hand was all wrapped up in bandages because he was cutting himself. And I thought, maybe he should look at a different profession, but he really wanted to continue in that. So we, again, addressed that problem and he no longer cuts himself. I had someone on the equestrian team here. And how do you control the horse? It's by subtle pressure on the flanks. Well, if you have that difficulty, you underpress or overpress because you can't regulate pressure. Again, we addressed that and she started winning competitions. So all of these areas are really critical. And I think sometimes what we think of as human error might be a cognitive mismatch. I worked with an individual who was doing his residency in pathology at a teaching hospital in the United States. And he had what we call object recognition. So, there's a part of the brain that recognizes symbol patterns and there's a part that recognizes objects. He had the object piece. And so he was examining a slide with breast tissue. So it was somebody that had had cancer, breast cancer, and they'd gone through chemotherapy and radiation, and that was to determine were they in remission. And so he knew how important this was. So he was looking really, really carefully and being very diligent. And he was just about to sign off that the person was in remission when his supervisor came and said, "Didn't you see these cells up here? This is cancer." And it wasn't that he hadn't seen them, he hadn't registered what he was looking at. He exited out of his program, addressed that function, and he won't make that mistake again. But we would have chalked that up to human error. So if we want to think about one of these cognitive functions, this is now symbol recognition in the left hemisphere. And some researchers call this the brain's letterbox or visual word form area. We call it symbol recognition. So this is the part of the brain that holds the visual symbol pattern for spelling, for reading, even learning chemistry equations, anything that you learn as a visual symbol pattern. So if you want to try this, you think of the word cat, and you can close your eyes if you want to, and see, can you conjure up the image of those three letters in your mind's eye? And some people will see it really crisply as if it's written on a blackboard. It might be fuzzy. And the students that we work with, that a number of them, they're struggling with reading, just see black, like the backs of their eyelids. So if there's a difficulty here, this is the poor word recognition, reading speed will be slow. This is the student that can see the same word on the page multiple times and not recognize it. If they're strong here, this is what was one of my strengths, you have the photographic visual memory for text. So what do we do? And again, these work on a continuum. If there's a difficulty here, this is the exercise for this area. And the language on the computer screen here is Amharic from Ethiopia. And we have multiple different languages built into this program. And sometimes people will say, well, this child is struggling with English. Why are you giving him Amharic to look at? And the idea is we remove the compensation. So if we used English, he might be able to put sound to it. He might be able to put meaning to it. There'd be familiarity. So he's looking at this language. He has to do a whole process to try to visualize it, hold it in his mind's eye. We start at very simple languages, and we go all the way up to Chinese, which is the most complex symbol set. And by the end of this program, the individual's holding 8 Chinese characters in their mind's eye. And at that point, English looks actually quite easy. But the idea is we're not teaching content. We're not teaching a skill. We're changing the brain's capacity to be able to learn the content and learn the skill. And all the exercises are designed around those principles: identify the function, remove the compensations, and target right into strengthening the area of difficulty. And this is nonverbal learning disability. One researcher calls this cognitive Goldilocks, which I really like. This is the part of the brain in the right hemisphere that allows you to put yourself into a social situation, a nonverbal situation, before you actually get into that situation, and imagine, how do you want to behave? What is the outcome that you want? So, and then when you create the plan, you go into the situation and you start to do the nonverbal moment-by-moment reading of the other people's reactions to then modify your behavior. So a good negotiator has to be really strong here, because you're doing all that reading of the nonverbal information. If somebody has difficulty here, this is the person that will leap before they look. They'll jump into a situation without taking everything into account, or they do what I call premature closure. They look at a few elements in the situation, make an interpretation, and then run with that, but they haven't seen everything that's going on, so their interpretation isn't either accurate or isn't complete. So this picture I showed to, I think she was 11 or 12 at the time, a young girl, and in her neighborhood, she had a reputation. The other children thought she lied all the time, and nobody wanted to play with her. So I had her look at this picture and asked her, what does she think is happening? And certainly in the original, it's a bit clearer. So she looked at the picture, she looked at me, and she said, they're playing badminton. And I don't know if this pointer works. So you can sort of see, it's hard to see in this picture, but she has netting on the front of her hat here, this woman, this hand's reached out. So this is an extreme example of premature closure. She looked at the netting, that triggered an association with a badminton net, and she didn't look at the rest of the information. Another student who was 18, she looked at this picture and she told me they were at City Hall here in Toronto. And certainly, okay, I'm not going to say anything political. I'll just stop that. But it doesn't really look like City Hall. But she pointed to the rope in the foreground because I asked her why she thought that. And she'd been to City Hall the week before, and there was an area cordoned off with a rope. So again, that concept of premature closure. So does this really affect the student academically? I mean, they won't be able to read the nonverbal cues from teachers, but huge impact socially, because they're misinterpreting the cues that are critical for social interaction. Both of these students, improved on this function, and they can now navigate socially. Because again, we're not teaching them social skills, we're changing the brain's capacity to learn those skills. So here are some of the strengths. If you're strong here, you're really, really skilled at doing that nonverbal reading. If you have difficulties, this is that premature closure. You really have trouble, registering social situations, and you actually have trouble interpreting your own emotions and attaching meaning to your own emotions. So not just being able to read externally, but also to read internally. And what are some of the outcomes? So as students work on this program, I mean, one of the things where we know we're successful with the adolescent class is they all start dating because they can navigate the dating world. It makes them not really want to do their homework, but it's positive. So all these things change. So it's not just the reading, but it's the problem solving in social situations, being able to plan nonverbally, plan socially, and interpret and modulate their own emotions. So really, a critical area for social emotional well-being, and emotional intelligence is linked to this. So if we think about Arrowsmith, the program, I call our program a capacity-based program because we're saying you can actually change the capacity of the learner to learn. We're not modifying the external. So a lot of programs, if the child is struggling, they will use a compensation or a workaround. If the child can't write, teach them to type or on the computer. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. They're all beneficial, but it's changing the external to match the profile of the learner. What we're arguing is you can actually change the profile of the learner. You can take what is an area of difficulty or challenge, and you can turn it into a strength. So we're not teaching content, we're not teaching skill, we're not teaching strategy, we're changing the brain's capacity to learn in those very specific cognitive functions. And if people like research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the research, it's all summarized in this document on our website. So we've done lots of research studies over the years with different researchers, different universities, different students in different schools, using different measures and different research designs. And all of the research is pointing in the same direction, that, that the rate of learning changes. This was a study done in the Toronto Catholic District School Board with 60 students. And what they looked at was before intervention, before coming into Arrowsmith Program, these students were learning about 2/3 of a year per year. And we know students with learning difficulties start to fall behind. They're not learning a year for year. We take them out of academics 50% of the day. So now 50% of the day they're doing cognitive programs, 50% of the day they're doing academic. They doubled and tripled their rate of learning at the end of the year on these academic skill areas. Because again, it's not about exposing them to the curriculum, it's changing the cognitive capacity to be able to engage with the curriculum. And again, this is all in that document on the website. This was a study done in a school in Melbourne, in Australia, and they look at standardized measures. They measure in grade 3 and grade 4 and grade 5, these students on standardized reading comprehension and standardized math tests at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. And then they look at each grade, what was their average academic growth over the course of the year. The gray is the students in the regular curriculum, the blue are students in the Arrowsmith program. And again, the students in the blue are getting 50% less academics than the students in the gray. And again, you can see change the cognitive capacity and their average academic growth improves. And this was a study done at the University of Calgary, was presented at the Canadian Psychological Association conference a few years ago. And again, looking at, this was academic measures, showing on the Woodcock-Johnson, so reading, mathematics, writing, receptive language. So here are like 3 studies, one in the Catholic School Board, one in a school in Australia, and this was University of Calgary, showing significant, these are all significant changes on academic measures. And what the researchers said was strengthening the cognitive functions presumed to underline the academic achievement is what is leading to those improvements, because we're not teaching them these skills, we're changing their capacity in the brain to be able to learn these skills. And then this was a UBC study. This was presented at a conference in New York City last February. Again, looking at a different group of students, but in the program where we're seeing significant changes on academic measures. And just one more quickly, this is a study done at Southern Illinois University in the States, again, showing significant changes. And these students are doing only, well, these students here, the UBC and this group were only doing 2 academic periods a day. They were getting 1 period of math and 1 period of English, and then 6 cognitive periods. So again, it wasn't exposure to the curriculum, it was changing the cognitive functioning that was leading to these changes. And this was, again, another study done at the University of Calgary, looking at changes on cognitive measures. So this is the Woodcock-Johnson. So seeing significant changes in students going through the program in all of these functions. So reasoning, processing speed, memory, phonemic awareness, working memory. So critical cognitive functions that are necessary for learning skills are changing along with the academics. This same thing. This is the University of British Columbia study that was again presented in New York City in last February. Again, showing significant changes on cognitive measures, and one more. This was Southern Illinois University. So we're gathering a body of evidence showing really important academic functions and achievement is changing at a significant level as students are going through here, even with much less exposure to academics, and very critical cognitive functions necessary for learning and acquiring skills are changing. And then this was a study, again, done at University of British Columbia, and this one is, I think, out for publication now. And this was looking at students in the school board, who are the blue, and the students in the red are students at Eton Arrowsmith School in Vancouver. So the students in red are getting only 2 academic periods a day. The students in blue are in a special education program in the school board, and they're getting all-day academics, and they're getting special education support. And you can see on cognition, the students in Arrowsmith significantly outperform the students in the school board. And you can see in the achievement, the students in the school board were actually falling a bit behind, which is not unusual. And the students only getting 1 period of math and English were significantly improved. So I argue the power of a capacity-based program is you change the capacity, the learning goes forward, because what do we learn with? We learn with our brains. So this was a summary that one of the researchers in New York said that basically there's a story in this research that something really fundamental is changing, and it's the capacity to learn, which is what we argue. And this capacity to learn is fundamental, not just in school, but also in life and in our vocation. And they're also pointing out that this data was just after 1 year of the students being in the program. And a lot of students require, because they have multiple areas of difficulty, more than 1 year. And then one of the researchers at UBC, her area is Kimberly Schoenert-Reichel. I think she actually does work with the WE organization, is on social emotional outcomes. And so she was curious as to what is changing as students go through this program. So she found from November to May, traditionally students on reported measures of happiness and well-being feel a little less happy and a little less well towards the end of the year because they're going into exams and it's a stressful period of time. Whereas the students in Arrowsmith actually felt happier and a better sense of well-being because now they had the cognitive capacity to engage with their exams. So she was quite interested in that result. And then she used self-report measures. I don't know if people know Carol Dweck's work, open-closed mindset, incremental theory of mind. So they used a method or a measure of incremental theory of mind, and no surprise. I mean, you can't be in a program that's where you're driving change in your brain and believe that your brain is fixed. So significant change on these kinds of measures where students actually felt they had locus of control, they were agents of change in their own life, a really, really positive change. And then this next change hadn't reached significance, but there was a trend of reduction in cortisol in the students going through the program. And if we know anything about cortisol, it's that stress hormone, and if it's too high, it can have a very negative impact on learning. So the fact that they were seeing over that span of time a decrease in cortisol was really quite important. And then this was a measure, again, this was a different group of researchers at UBC looking at social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes on the behavior assessment system for children. And what they found was all adaptive skills over the course of the year improved. So things like leadership, social skills, adaptability, all showed improvement, and all the maladaptive skills reduced. So things like anxiety, depression, withdrawal, conduct problems, all reduced. And then activities of daily living, organization, getting dressed, acts in a safe manner, listens, attention, all significantly improved. So multiple different ways to look at the benefit of the work in terms of social, emotional outcomes. And then what about students that don't have learning difficulties? We've done some studies with students in traditional classes not identified as having learning difficulties. We know there will be some students in that class that do have learning difficulties, but this is just a regular grade 1 class in a school, a publicly funded school in Australia. And they had 4 grade 1 classes, and we put one of the cognitive programs 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week in one class. And they used this Wold sentence copy test, which is a test of how quickly and accurately can you write material. And the exercise we put in was motor planning, which is being able to write quickly and accurately. And what we found was the students, in getting that 30 minutes of the program a day over the course of the year, outperformed in terms of their improvement on writing speed and accuracy over the course of the year. So you can see the 4 different classes. And what was interesting, the group at the school decided they had 5 students who had been identified in kindergarten as being at risk for reading difficulties. And they put all 5 into the class getting the 30 minutes a day of the Arrowsmith program. And 10 weeks into the program, they were all de-identified, because not only does this exercise work on motor planning in writing, but also motor planning in eye tracking, which is critical for reading. So that early intervention made a significant difference. And then this is a study that's going to be presented at a conference in Prague in July. This is a university in Madrid in Spain. We're working with a group of researchers there. And these are Spanish-speaking students. So this exercise, we have to train the teachers in English, but they can deliver the program in Spanish. So it was the reasoning exercise, the one that I developed for myself with the clocks. And 40 minutes a day, 5 days a week, over just a 3-month span, they improved with planning abilities, so executive functioning, problem solving, visual spatial reasoning ability, and attention. Just that short intervention. And these were students in just the regular grade 3 class. So, which makes sense. I mean, you enhance cognition, it will benefit the whole range of students. So now, just quickly into the imaging research, there are 2 labs right now that are doing imaging work on students in the program, one at UBC and one at Southern Illinois University. And this was a study, was presented at a conference, I think, in San Francisco last year. And one of the things I'm really excited about is I want to create a global data bank of images of the brains of students with learning difficulties that can be open to researchers, so we can understand more about what's going on with students as they're struggling with learning. So these are students without learning disabilities, kind of, looking at connectivity in the brain. Red, like the warmer the colors, the stronger the connections. But this is pretty typical of what's happening in a brain of somebody without learning difficulties. This is what's happening in the brain with somebody with learning difficulties. And what the research is showing is this idea of hyperconnectivity and underconnectivity, which means that there are areas that are underperforming and there are other areas. So those are the underconnected, and there are other areas trying to compensate. So they're working really, really hard, but they actually can't effectively compensate because they can't do the job of the areas that are underconnected. So, and if you look at or talk to students with learning difficulties, this is their experience. Often they're working really, really hard, but not necessarily efficiently, because their behavior is just a mirror of what's going on in their brains. So what is some of the research showing when we're doing this imaging? This was at time point 0, so before intervention, and 3 months in, and we saw the same pattern a year in. So this is, the students are in the scanner and they're doing the reasoning exercise, or reasonable facsimile, because you can't really move in the scanner. And at time point 0, before intervention, you can see the brain is really inefficient in its processing. It's calling on a lot of real estate to try to carry out this task. 3 months in, much more efficient. And you want your brain to be efficient. What Dr. Boyd says is, we don't always want to have to be doing maximal effort in our brains. It's just like our muscles. If your brain is fit and accomplished at a task, you should be able to dial it down, and that frees your cognitive resources to do other things. So that idea of the hyperconnectivity and the inefficiency in processing, we're seeing that shift, that there's more efficient processing in the brain as students are going through this program. And then this is resting state brain activity. Again, before intervention, 3 months in, and the same pattern that we saw a year in. And you can see the brain right here, that little tiny red dot. That's the prefrontal cortex. That's your planning, thinking, problem solving, executive functioning, a really, really critical area. And what you can see with this group of students is not a lot of activation. So it plays out in them being disorganized, not being able to really effectively develop strategies for problem solving. 3 months in, much more activation. So this area is starting to come online, and it's critical for goal-oriented behavior. This is you set up a goal, and this is the part of the brain that allows you to create a plan as to how you're going to accomplish that goal, and then not get distracted as you're working towards that goal. It's really critical for also perspective taking, so being able to put yourself into somebody else's shoes. It's critical. Working memory is related to this, using past experiences to plan for future occurrences. So a really, really important function here. And I remember one student, as she was improving in this area, came to me and looked quite depressed, and I was really surprised because I thought she'd be really happy. Her parents were really happy because she was, making much better rational decisions, but she said, "I have a stop sign in my brain now." And she said, "I'm not so sure I like it," because she said before she was very impulsive, right? Because she couldn't stop and think about something before she actually did it. And now she said she goes to start something, the stop sign comes up, stops her, and then she thinks about it. Over time, she made peace with the stop sign, but it is critical for regulating behavior. There's a new case study in the third edition of my book, which sadly is somewhere in transit between Australia and here, so we didn't have it for tonight. But it's this individual who had finished university, but kind of drifting, not really going anywhere. It was like he had incredible gifts, like his right hemisphere, spatial, mechanical, reasoning, phenomenal. But it was like he had this incredible capacity, but no engine to really drive it. So he was drifting, and his parents were really in despair, and he'd been labeled as lazy. So he came in, we did the assessment, and he had a difficulty in this area. It would never have been identified as having a learning difficulty, but it meant that he couldn't really utilize his gifts. We worked on this and addressed it. He decided after a year in the program to go back to school. He did a design degree. He won every award, I think, in the province of Ontario in design. He designed a new ambulance, and he came second place in the world Michelin competition designing a racing car. Just remarkable. So we didn't give him those gifts, but we gave him the capacity to use the gifts. And this is in his own words, he said, "I began to organize my thoughts more effectively and to plan ahead. First a few weeks ahead, then a few months ahead. For the first time in my life, I had real long-term goals and was able to take steps towards achieving them." So no longer lazy and no longer drifting. I mean, he was never lazy. He just had the cognitive difficulty. So how many minutes? Just about done? Okay, so we're just really quickly. So these are 4 networks that we're looking at in the research. The default mode, the dorsal attention, the salience, and the frontal parietal are executive control, and just kind of what they do. So like I'm thinking about something, the salience or the dorsal attention, what's going on. The salience network, really important. This says what's critical, what's essential, what should I be paying attention to? And then the executive control is how should I respond? And we're seeing changes in all of these networks in the research that's being done. So really fundamental, critical networks. This is the 6-week, we have a 6-week summer intensive program here. We have people flying in from all around the world that do this. And in 6 weeks, we took the amount of time in our 10-month part-time program, we compressed it into 6 weeks. That's why we call it intense, because it's 4 to 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for 6 weeks on this one exercise. But what we're seeing is significant changes in the salience network, the default mode network, the executive control network as students work on this cognitive exercise. So again, planning, reasoning, thinking, all shifting as they go through this. And then this was on standardized measures. Again, this is all in our literature or in on our website. So in 6 weeks, these cognitive functions are changing as these students go through this program at that intense level. level, and academic fluency, which makes sense because it's not, in 6 weeks, they're not going to be necessarily learning a lot of content, but they're getting faster at processing and more accurate in the content that they already know. And then this was parent observation, so 35 parents about 2 months after the students went back to their homes, rating changes that they had seen on a number of measures. So again, all supports the changes that are happening in the brain, the changes that are happening academically and cognitively. And I just want to read what one mother said, if I can find it here. In terms of the salience network, because it is really important. And also as we age, that's one of the networks that goes offline. So I'm going to go back and do this program and get my salience network back. So this was a mother of a student in a school, I think in Texas, who's in the program. And she said 6 months into the program, he literally woke up. Similar to the stories of patients in a coma waking up. One day he walked into the classroom and anxiously asked, "Where have I been? Why haven't I noticed all these things before?" That's the salience network. What we see a lot of students, like I talked about being in a fog. Other students talk about they have dark glasses on and the glasses come off. What awakened here was his salience network. All these things were happening around him, but he couldn't register them or know what their significance is, and now he is. And in fact, we just got a video from his mother. He just graduated high school, is that right? And stood up and gave a speech about his experience, and his mother was in tears. But to me, it's so profound. You change the brain in fundamental ways, you then change the whole reality and the experience of the individual. And this is what's happening after 10 months in the academic program. So the same idea. What we're seeing is there's a reduction in the hyperconnectivity, so that inefficient connectivity that's compensating, and there's an increase in the underconnectivity. So those underfunctioning areas are starting to function, so the rest of the brain can kind of relax and be more efficient in the processing. And just summary, these are all the cognitive and academic outcomes that we're seeing across all of the research. And then these are the social emotional outcomes that we're seeing, because it's you change the brain, it's the whole way that individual engages with the world. So it's not just academic or cognitive, it's social and emotional. And I just want to read quickly, and then I will stop, what one of the researchers, Greg Rose, so at the conference or his presentation in New York City last February, he said, "What have we learned?" He says, "We know that Arrowsmith training strengthens network connectivity, but such training also reduces hyperconnectivity. These students start relatively poorly and end relatively well. The whole system is moving in a positive direction. There is neuroplasticity as a function of Arrowsmith training, which improves performance. Nothing changes in your brain, nothing changes in your performance. Big change in the brain, big change in performance." And of course, this is not the final answer, but I think it's really suggestive that changes in the brain are in fact driving changes in performance. So do precise Arrowsmith cognitive exercises activate and functionally change particular areas or networks of the brain? The answer is yes. And when I read Rosenzweig's challenge in 1977, he was the professor at Berkeley working with the rats, his challenge was, could we take this research out of the laboratory with rats and could we apply it to human beings? And I took his intent very seriously when I read that in 1977 and started to develop and create cognitive exercises. And this has been sort of the journey of my life, and devoted my life to answering that question. Can we take this research into improving the lives of individuals struggling with learning difficulties? And what we know practically from our experience working with people, and now what the research is confirming, is that yes, that we can make that change. And what is my vision for this work? I would like to make it accessible in every school around the world, so it is an option for children that are struggling with learning difficulties. That's really where my passion is, because I know what that experience is like firsthand, but also to make it available to students in regular academics. So maybe some of those cognitive mismatches that we see in adults with some of that human error might be addressed early on. So, we all have a brain that mediates our relationship to the world, and we now know that we can change our brains. So not only does our brain shape us, but we can shape our brains. And what I think it does is it allows these individuals to not only to dare to dream, but to have the cognitive wherewithal to actually effectively realize their dreams. So I want to thank you. And then Debbie, I think are you coming up?
Thank you, Barbara, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Debbie Gilmore. Oh, sorry, I would also like to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to those watching our live stream around the world. Welcome to you as well. My name's Debbie Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of Arrowsmith, and it's my pleasure now to introduce you to our panel that we have to answer your questions this evening. So could I please ask our panel to come up? And I think we just have to set some seats on this stage here. So let me introduce you to our panel this evening. Right over on the end, we have Jennifer Harris. Jennifer is a parent who has had 2 sons enrolled at Arrowsmith School in Toronto. One son has transitioned into elementary school from the school, and the other transitioned into high school. Jennifer's very happy to connect with families and answer questions about her Arrowsmith experience as well as those of her son. Next, we have Barbara. I don't need to introduce her. Then we have Jason Kinsey, and he's been with Arrowsmith School for over 10 years. He's worked firstly as a cognitive teacher and now as the principal and our admissions coordinator at the school. As part of his duties, Jason connects with families on a daily basis to learn more about their needs and how Arrowsmith School may be able to help them. Next, we have Sherry Lane Howie. Sherry Lane has been in education for over 20 years and spending the last 11 at our school here in Toronto. Sherry Lane creates individualised mathematics programs for our students, and working with our English teacher, Mr. T, who's also in the room this evening, and Sherry Lane helps map students' Arrowsmith journeys with an eye on their planned transition back to a more traditional learning environment or out of into further education or into the workplace. And then we have Marika Katani, who is an alumni of Arrowsmith School and most recently completed her diploma in police foundations. And she has got a lovely place in her heart for Arrowsmith School. Starting in 2015, Marika has joined us every summer as a teaching assistant in our cognitive intensive program, and just recently has started with our school as a teaching assistant while she's getting ready to continue her study. It's wonderful to have an alumni working with our students because she's able to make meaningful connections with the students. She's able to speak with authority around, because she's sat in those seats, she's led the same path as those students. So it's really lovely to have Marika on board. So I would love to take your questions now. We have 2 people in the room with microphones. So if you'd like to raise your hands if you have a question and then direct it to any member of our panel. Thank you.
What steps would you take to implement this in schools, like policy-wise, and also what can teachers do?
Answer that? Okay. I mean, we're in multiple schools around the world. So usually it starts with a conversation, either with a teacher, sometimes with an administrator, a lot of times with parents. Like, parents are very powerful advocates, and they go out and knock on doors and talk to administrators at schools to see if they would be interested in starting a dialogue with us. And certainly Tara, who's over there, works with schools all around the world. Debbie, she's has done that as well. To have a conversation so they can understand what we do. Then we train teachers. We just have a team now that is just finishing up in Australia tomorrow, training teachers in the Southern Hemisphere. We do training here in our summer as well. So our goal is to train teachers, but they can't be trained in isolation. They have to be trained to be able to go back into a school that's implementing the program. So they get trained in all the methodology to take it into their schools. But the first starts with a conversation and dialogue. We do webinars. So I don't know, Debbie, if you have anything you want to add to that, or Tara? No.
Talk to me if you're interested. And as Barbara describes, we're really invested and really interested to bring this work into schools. That's where it belongs. That's where the struggle is, both the students and as a teacher. As a teacher, once upon a time in a mainstream school, the teachers are struggling too. They want to do right by those kids, and they're struggling to do so. So we're really motivated to work as closely with schools as possible. And that's part of my role in the organization. So we can chat afterwards if you'd like.
Another question?
My question is in regards to cultural differences between the programs, because you mentioned that they are worldwide, and we do know that there are cultural differences between these places. So how has that been implemented into the training that is given?
Well, I can speak. I mean, we haven't seen the extent, I mean, the cultural differences in terms of the brains of individuals. It sort of, there certainly isn't that. So, I mean, we really haven't seen it as an issue. I mean, we're in Malaysia, we're in Thailand, Spain. So, we've had conversations, and Debbie's going to present in Mumbai and Bengaluru. We haven't necessarily seen that, and we would work with the educational system, like to be informed if there were things that we needed to, take into account, given cultural differences. But so far, other than language pieces, but a number of the exercises are language agnostic. It doesn't matter what language the individual speaks. We can still do the exercise. So, I mean, it's a really interesting question. And certainly we would take the advice of the organization that we are going into.
I'd just like to add to that. Having spent most of my career in Sydney in Australia, and then now living here, actually, while we do deliver the program around the world in different cultures, every classroom has multiple cultures within it, and we have not seen the differences coming about because of that. So I think that we could safely say that we're not seeing the differences there.
Yeah. At one point in the Vancouver School Board, at one point the program was there, and I think when I spoke to parents, I had 6 translators, right? So I was and the students all made progress. So certainly we would respect whatever cultural differences, but we haven't yet seen it make a difference in terms of the impact of the program.
Over here, while Tara's there, I'll get those questions answered, and then Tara will move over here.
Marika, could you maybe give us a perspective of what it's like for the student going through the program?
Yeah, of course. Oh, thanks. So before I found Arrowsmith, before I found Arrowsmith, I was in an elementary school from grade 1 to 4, and I could say I really struggled. It was so hard for me to go to school, and in junior kindergarten, my teacher said that I couldn't follow 3-step instructions, and she actually told my parents that. And that's when my parents realized, oh, that's an issue that we have to address. So going from grade 1 to 4, I couldn't read, I couldn't write, I couldn't spell, I couldn't articulate my thoughts, my feelings, and I had a lot of trouble. And I could watch my classmates read chapter books, write journals, and here I am thinking, where do I begin? I didn't even know how to write my name. I didn't even know how to write the date. So by grade 4, I was assessed and diagnosed with a learning disability, and my mother found Arrowsmith, and I went through the Saturday programs. I did the MSS, which is word and tracing. So my mother took me to do that, and then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I did part-time, and I worked on different exercises apart from my Saturday program. And by the end of grade 4, my parents decided to take me out of my elementary school and put me into Arrowsmith. And oh my gosh, I remember that feeling. And I said, no, Mom, no, you're not doing this to me. This is a nightmare. I'm not going to leave my friends. I'm not going to leave my school. I'm not going to leave my life because this is so unfair. Like, why would I do that? And it took a lot of perseverance from them. And I'm pretty sure I broke their hearts by saying, no, I don't want to. And this is the worst decision ever. So end of grade 4, I went to Arrowsmith, and I was about 9. And the first 4 months at Arrowsmith, my family and I saw massive changes. I could read, I could write, I could spell, I could articulate everything. And my mom remembers me saying on the TTC, do not stand beside the doors. And she was like, wow, this is amazing. Step number 1, I could read the TTC advertisements. And she was astonished. I was like, I did it. You know, in elementary school, a lot of teachers were pinning me down. They were saying, stop being lazy. Try your hardest. You know, you really got to do this. You really got to try. And I really was trying. I couldn't do it. And after 4 months at Arrowsmith, I realized, wow, this program is really working. And at the time, my mom thought I would have to be so dependent on her for life. And seeing those changes, she's like, wow, Marika can be independent now. She can live her own world. And now that I look back on it, that was the best decision that she made. And I want to thank her so much for that. And I know I gave her a lot of hard times, but it really helped, and I succeeded. So then after Arrowsmith, I went into high school, but at the time, the principal and my parents decided not to put me into high school because I missed out on the regular school curriculum for 4 years. So they thought that it'd be best to go back into grade 8 and just worry about what grade 8s worry about, not the high school stuff like volunteering hours, the credits, thank you. And I was like, no, that's not happening. You know how weird that's gonna be? I'm gonna be 14, they're gonna be 13, not gonna happen. And I did it, I adapted, it was okay. And now I can say that I really enjoyed it. It was probably the best decision that my family and I made. And now I just graduated college, Police Foundations, and I'm here talking to you guys. So I really have to say, without the support, without the dedication, the hard work, and like the love and sacrifice my parents, especially my mother, put in, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't have graduated high school. I wouldn't have graduated college. And without Barbara-Arrowsmith, sorry, looking at the wrong person, without Barbara-Arrowsmith's work, I wouldn't have succeeded, and I wouldn't be in my life where I am now. So yes, thank you to her. I hope that answered your question.
I just want to follow up. Reika and I started the school at similar time, so I was Marika's teacher, and we're very proud of her. And one thing she didn't mention was when she first came to us, and I might choke up, she was never allowed to go out for break. or recess because she was always behind and trying to catch up. And when she came to Arrowsmith, she went out for break the first time and she was like, wow, this is what recess is like. This is what break's like. So she's come a long way.
Yeah. I think we had a question over here.
I have a question about the personalized approach that you were mentioning, because I know that every kid is different. How do you gear it towards their individual issues?
I mean, you created the assessment, but so every student that comes to Arrowsmith, they spend about a day and a half with our psychometrist, Janice Jordan, who runs them through a battery of in-house developed assessment pieces, and the result of which is an individualized learning profile, which highlights a student's strengths and their difficulties. This really forms the roadmap for our recommendations going forward of which cognitive functions we need to focus on and in the most appropriate order. So every student's program is based on that profile, and then they are programmed for 6 or 8 of the hardest things that we can find for them to do all day long. And once they show us that any one part of any one exercise starts to get easy, we celebrate it and then we make it harder. And we're always looking to increase the capacity and really force them to strengthen those emergent connections.
Anyone on this side? No, Tara, I think we need to exercise tonight.
Okay, I guess this is on. Okay, so obviously the focus, I think you have the right focus in terms of elementary school, high school being where it should be. But it's sort of, I think I'm probably not the only one, adult per se, hearing a lot of this and sort of recognizing some of the things that my blockages per se. So in other words, what I'm sort of getting at is the fact that presently right now, all over, there are disruptive technologies going on, right? So, it disrupts the economy and all this kind of stuff. So in other words, a lot of people are being disrupted. So, as adults. So a lot of these people, perhaps are in the idea of possibly changing career. So in other words, what I'm sort of saying is that this can sort of address, possibly taking that, a career change or whatever, basically, because I think probably a lot of people recognize some of their own issues and stuff. And so this could sort of address those kind of things. Obviously, the focus still needs to be where it needs to be is in the formative years. It has to be there. It has to be there. But this, to me, this is an area of possibility to look at some point. If you have, the resources, what have you, because, this addresses workforce and being able to make sure the capacity of, the economy is reached, because, as we know, the retirement age is going up, and, trying to make effective use of the workforce. And, we've got a larger gig economy. So to me, I think this is sort of an area to sort of look at. And I don't know if this is sort of being looked at.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And we've had conversations like when we go various places. So we've had conversations with Kiwi Rail in New Zealand, some other corporations. Absolutely, we think it's really important, exactly for what you're saying, not only for that, cognitive glitch, cognitive mismatch piece that you can make people within their jobs more effective and efficient, but also help people if they want to change and do transition. So, I mean, we've definitely had people adults that have come into the program and then switched and gone into different fields. I mean, one of the stories in the book that's not here is a lawyer who then went back to school and became a naturopath, like after going through the work. So absolutely, it's one of the challenges with this work is there's so many applications, right? I didn't talk about it, but we're doing some studies with a different group of researchers at UBC with an organization called ABI Wellness that's out of Burnaby in British Columbia that's taking 4 of the cognitive programs, a higher order, and working with people with acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury. And we're seeing the same patterns in the brains of hyperconnectivity and underconnectivity, and the same kinds of changes as we're seeing with individuals with learning difficulties. It seems to be the brain's way of compensating for a challenge is to do this hyperconnection. So there's that group, there's the individuals with learning difficulties, there's cognitive enhancement, there's the workforce, and then aging. There's one of the new case studies is a 73-year-old entrepreneur whose son went through the program and he decided to do it very, very effective and feels he's even more effective. So huge application. We are a small organization trying to do some Herculean things, and we are not deterred. We will, I will talk to anybody, anywhere, to see what the possibilities are for this work.
And if anyone is interested in adult programs, on our website we have participating sites, and if you click into each of those sites, it will tell you whether they have a school-age program, an adult program. So there are organisations around the world that offer adult programs.
Okay, I'm sorry for trying to monopolize this thing, but what you're talking about as well sort of dovetails, and maybe this has been thought about because you did bring it up quite a bit in your talk, but this actually, has applications to mental health actually as well. That's the thing. So I'm not, I think you've got a few things going on.
Yeah, I mean, definitely mental health. I mean, and we're seeing that with the students with learning difficulties, and the research that was presented at the 13th World Brain Congress or Brain Injury Congress with the ABI group, again, showing reduction in depression, anxiety, all of that. Like it's, I mean, I know, for my life, you have these difficulties, it causes mental health issues, right? Yeah.
Many students, sorry.
Hi.
As a teacher,
sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Hi. For me, I think it's too bad that I didn't find about your research, everything in 2006. In 2006, my son was grade 4. Well, I had a very hard time with him. He couldn't read English, maybe because we were speaking a different language at home and we're writing. And because I didn't have support from the school at that time, I did the research on my own. I was in contact with a lot of people around the world, and for me, whatever I found was a difference between girls and boys. And whatever I did and learned at that time, it seems that it worked. He finished university, and he has a job, but I still remember, and I will always remember, there was a guy, I don't remember actually the name, from Sydney, Australia, who told me that if he's not going to read in grade 4, when he's going to be in high school, he's going to have problems with readings, and I need to do everything, whatever is necessary in grade 4. Then he started reading, I've done whatever. He had challenge in high school. My question is there a pattern that later on in life, as an adult, can he have problems with reading? Not necessarily with English, because he spends too much time now. It's like he's been for all his life in Canada. But with reading.
I mean, it's possible. I mean, these functions work on continuums, and they also continue to develop as the brain is developing over time. So, they can kind of come up to a point to hit a critical mass where learning, just because developmental changes can become somewhat easier. But if he struggled with reading, I mean, it's quite possible. I don't know. I mean, are there still areas where he struggles? Okay. So maybe then whatever you did, had an impact. Like I never would say that the work that we have is the only solution to learning difficulties. I believe there are multiple windows into the brain to stimulate function and improve function. So whatever you did obviously was successful for your son. So kudos to you for all the effort that you and all the research that you did to find something that benefited him.
Hi, Barbara. Congratulations on your work. I was interested in coming down. I'm a registered social worker and psychotherapist. My interest is mental health, but I see a lot of intersections with neurology and psychiatry, obviously. I'm just wondering, in the work that you do, have you noticed that your applications are transferable to other types of conditions like concussions or epilepsy or other type of conditions that can perpetuate mental health issues?
Yeah, well, certainly concussions, and that's the work that we're doing. That's a subset of the work that we're doing, or the Acquired Brain in ABI Wellness and Watson Center Society for Brain Health out west are working with and having lots of really interesting conversations with Corrections Canada, because we know there's a high incidence of individuals in the prisons population that have acquired brain injury or learning difficulties. So that's another group. But certainly, we see individuals who suffer from depression and anxiety and also sometimes self-medicate, so addictions, where what's driving that are the learning difficulties. I mean, obviously they can have those conditions and not be related to learning difficulties. But if it is, then if we aren't going to address the learning difficulty, I don't believe we can effectively address the condition of the mental health issue, because it's being driven from the challenges that an individual has in engaging in the world. I mean, in my case, I attempted suicide at age 13, and it was despair, and I could have gone in therapy. First of all, I didn't have insight, so I wouldn't have benefited, but it was the cognitive difficulty that led to that despair. I mean, I struggled through elementary school. I could not imagine how I could go to high school, what could that be? So my option, or my only thing that I could see, was ending my life. So in that case, it was the cognitive that drove the despair. And we meet students, Debbie and I, when we go around the world, and just next Thursday heading off on a 10.5-week tour, and I get to meet students all around the world that struggle with this and hear the stories. I've met students that are anorexic, driven by the cognitive difficulties, that are suicidal, driven by the cognitive difficulties, or depressed, driven by the cognitive difficulties.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how you were able to get to the right people to mobilize things in the way that you did, because I see a really strong need for changes, obviously, in terms of assessment from very early, and not just with children, like with adults as well. And they have a lot of, so they might have epilepsy that is, undiagnosed. And usually if you go to a doctor and you tell them what your symptoms are, and if it's mental health related, they'll send you to see a psychiatrist, and there's no investigation into having an MRI or what else is going on. So I'm just wondering how you were able to make the connections that you did, because there really is a need for neuroplasticity, and obviously it's applicable. The brain is very complex, and it's applicable in many fields, but it just doesn't seem that we're moving in the right direction. If anyone has any type of distress, it just goes to mental health, and they don't seem to make the other connections.
Yeah, I think it's education. I've spoken at CAMH, I've spoken at Columbia Department of Psychiatry. I think it's a process of education, because that's this idea where I talk about cognitive lens. Really, often cognition and the brain is not in that equation of mental health, and it needs to be part of the conversation. And that's Norman Deutsch here, in Toronto, who's a psychiatrist, got interested in my work in 2000 because he was seeing clients that he was working with that, when he listened to them, he thought, this is cognitive, it's not emotional, it's leading to emotional effects. And so we started a whole dialogue and conversation, and he referred a number of his clients to me and tracked and saw the changes. So it is a huge area. I mean, we see some women that get into abusive relationships with the reasoning difficulty because they can't reason. I was in a very abusive relationship because, I couldn't see that I was being conned or the logical inconsistencies because my brain didn't process logic. So there's lots of work to be done. If I write another book, that's the book that I want to write, is not the mental health of cognitive functions in the sense that kids are anxious or depressed, but there's the idea is our personality is being developed, that certain cognitive functions are coming online developmentally to allow us to have certain experiences. Well, what happens if they don't come online as expected? We aren't going to be able to have those experiences. I mean, I got diagnosed all sorts of things that absolutely weren't true. I don't even want to say the labels. But it's because they were trying to understand my behavior, but they weren't recognizing it was cognitive that was driving it. And after I did that one exercise, every night as I was going to sleep, because I have a really strong visual memory, scenes would play through my mind's eye from age 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. I say, oh my gosh, that's why this happened. That's why that happened. That's why this person did that. It felt like that fractured, fragmented psyche started to integrate into a whole healthy human being, which never had been in my whole entire history. So it has profound implication. And, beyond writing about it or talking about it, or I will, as I said, if you've got people you want me to talk to, I will talk to them, because it's a missing piece. Like really the brain is not in lots of equations. The brain is actually not in the education equation. Sadly, it isn't. It's not really, I mean, it is in some research places, or it's not really in the mental health equation, in a lot of ways. So we need to bring the brain into these equations because it is a piece.
And the mental health piece, just to add to that in the classroom, most of the students that I see that come through the door, now I do teach math, but and a lot of students are terrified of math, but they also come with a lot of fears, and a lot of the students hate themselves, and a lot of the students have been bullied. And it's wonderful to see, because one of the first things that they'll comment on is that this is the first school that understands me. Mm-hmm. This is the first school that the teachers get me. And they'll say, this is the first time I've made a friend, because all of a sudden cognitively they're able to make friends because they're understanding the relationships around them. So it's really important that anytime a parent comes to us and they come to us with a younger child, I'm always so thankful, because they don't have as much baggage as when they come to us when they're a teenager. They've had a lot more hurt and pain. So it's really wonderful when parents can find us when the students are younger.
There's one over there. Someone has a microphone. Oh, sorry, Jennifer. Yes.
I could add to, I got it. I could add to the mental health piece for both my kids. There was a lot of shame and embarrassment of not being able to achieve anything prior to Arrowsmith, and when they arrived, I honestly sort of opened the door, let them get out, and I drove away because I was so happy somebody else was going to help me with this. But their positive self-confidence came, and they work really hard at all of these exercises. That cannot be stressed enough. It is hard work. Not only do they work hard because it also makes them feel better, and then they can start seeing that they're making improvements, cognitive improvements, but they also learn how to work hard, and they learn that if you work hard, you can achieve what you want to achieve. Now, the transition out of the schools, it was easier for my younger son to transition out because he was going into grade 5. But my older son went into grade 9, and in grade 9, he sort of had his head down. He wanted to prove to himself that he could do the academic subjects just the way anybody else could. And he was very successful at that. Grade 10 was much harder. It was almost like he's like, okay, I can do this. But he looked up and he started looking around and understand, like those pictures that Barbara showed, seeing the life around him, and he didn't like what he had seen. So he went into this sort of depression that we couldn't understand. We went to doctors and psychiatrists and therapists, and everybody had their own opinion, and none of it was correct. And I finally went back to Arrowsmith and said, what do I do? And Barbara said, it's not that he's, a couple things. He's mourning the loss of what he thought the world was before he could see the world for what it really was. And he's also mourning the fact that he doesn't like what he's seeing. So he's, because he had no learned experiences on how to deal with the world that he was seeing. So even though he was 14, he didn't remember not being invited to the birthday party when he was in grade 3 and how that felt. So there were all these learned experiences that he had missed that he was now at 14, 15 years old having to learn for the first time. Mm-hmm. So the mental health part comes at the beginning, and then you sort of recover while you're in the program. But then there's also the piece at the end that you have to adapt towards. So it's a lifelong learning. He's now in university and doing just fine, changing programs a little bit, but he has the self-confidence to do it. Mm-hmm. And now he has these learned experiences on how to deal with different situations. So.
Thank you. We just have a question over here. I think someone has the microphone there.
Hi there. First off, Barbara, thank you so much for telling us about your experience, as I completely resonate with you, as I've recently been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and ADHD. So I've realized that a lot of my cognitive behavior seemed very abnormal growing up. But now realizing that there are adult classes really helps. And I was wondering, in regard to that, in the future of Arrowsmith, sorry, that if there would be workshops available for post-secondary students that are hoping and wanting to improve their cognitive behaviors and learning abilities, as a lot of the times I find a lot of my colleagues, peers, who drop courses or drop programs due to the fact that they believe that they can't learn these subjects and such, that they're completely not able to do that program or field. I mean, I definitely have struggled with that. I'm a broadcast journalist. I hate writing. I love video. And I realize I learn better visually than I do, through writing and such. I mean, more I'm towards broadcasting now than print, but I was just wondering if that could be in the works of the future for Arrowsmith.
We definitely have part-time adult programs that run all year round, and we're just now trialing 2 programs remotely. So I think we're in our second year of doing that. It was these parents that would come from all around the world for the intensive program, and then they go back home where there wasn't a program. So the motor planning exercise, so we have staff here in Toronto that Skype in all around the world with students, and if the student's young, they then train the parent on that exercise and on the reasoning, the one that I created for myself. Mm-hmm. And that one, because we always trial new delivery models here in Toronto first before we put them out in the world, because my commitment is to every individual that engages with this program to be as certain as I can that it will be of benefit in that delivery model. So we've pretty much come to that point where it's working well. So that's also an option. Even if they're not remote, there's sometimes where somebody can't get into our part-time program during the evening, but they could do the work remotely. So the person to contact would be get Jason's details, and he can go over that. And we're seeing success. I mean, really, if I had one thing to leave to the world, it would be that program, the reasoning, because it is so powerful. Because the nature is an association area, is connected with all the rest of your brain. So stimulation there has a spillover effect, and that's why we're seeing it changing so many different networks in the brain. The other exercises are important also. I'm not discounting them. However, that one's incredibly powerful, and that's one of the ones we're delivering through our remote program.
We'll take about 2 or 3 more questions, and then the panel will be here afterwards if you would like to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I do a lot of work with military families through a foundation that supports military families, veterans, and PTSD is a major issue. So is there a specific program, and maybe I'll get some contact details from you a little bit later, that I can introduce to the board where you've got some proven success with PTSD patients?
I don't at this point, but I mean, if I look at the research, the Salience Network is certainly implicated in post-traumatic stress disorder. I would be really interested to look at trying to do a pilot there. I mean, separate from if they're concussive pieces, that we've had impact, like, blast injury can lead to a concussion, but the post-traumatic stress disorder, I think that that reasoning exercise could have significant benefit. So I'd love to have a conversation.
Right now, we're having a tsunami of baby boomers and Generation X. And I'm in that sphere right now. But I'm dealing with so many people with, we notice our short-term memory is not that great. And they call it the seniors moment. What I want to ask, do you think you'll ever have a program that we can do from home for people like my generation?
Yeah, and that's this remote program that we're trialing is the person's doing it at home. We have somebody that works in our office in Toronto that Skypes in with people, would train them, then the person goes away and does the work, and then when they master a level, they have to Skype back in with the facilitator to learn the next level. So absolutely, and the one that we're trialing is, I think, the most powerful one for people as we age. I've got a number of my friends that are my age doing it as well.
So you're getting the words out among boomers and Generation
Well,
X?
we've because we've been trialing it here in Toronto, we're just kind of at a point now that we're comfortable. So we haven't really done any marketing or building awareness. It's sort of, but that's probably over this summer, we will be looking at doing that. Yes, so watch our website.
And,
the Senior Moment Program.
We have a question over here.
Hi, my daughter actually attended your part-time program a couple of years ago, and that was not enough. I think she has sort of some pervasive things, and I would love to, we're here tonight to kind of re-explore again. One thing I've heard a couple of times, because she's now in grade 10, 15 years old, and from different places, mental health places, because she's seeing some of the downslide of that after having some issues for a long time. And I'm just curious, a lot of people, and I think it came up earlier, they mentioned kids who perhaps either were bullied or didn't have a lot of friends that have attended the program and so forth. Have any of you had an experience you could share or something around a child that is cloaking themselves in sort of social competencies or helping others with issues and things like that as a way of withdrawing from school and academics, as you know what I mean? So one of our issues is we've been wanting to try and change schools or look at different programs and things, but the big issue that comes up is I can't leave my friends, but yet she's not going to school, yet she's not,
Mm-hmm.
It's really common, and particularly around the high school age. It's so, you are who your friends are. And I mean, as a parent, my little boy just started on January 6th. He's in grade 3. And every day on our commute in and every day on our commute home, he talks about wanting to go back to his old school because he misses his friends. Once a student is recognizing that they're benefiting from the exercises and they recognize that Arrowsmith is not a forever school, unlike all the other independent schools in the city, students don't come to us from kindergarten to grade 12 or kindergarten to grade 8. We have the stated goal as a staff to help them transition back out as quick as can be. And if a student can, it's so hard to engage in a reflective practice to think about how your school struggles are affecting your life in general. But once a student's able to start making connections with what they're doing at our St. Clair location is making things easier in the long term, then that might give them what they need to come through our door on a regular basis. It's hard. It takes a lot of coaxing. I mean, I think that it requires, us talking to parents. If there's some way that we can connect the students with other students that are a little bit farther along. I was sharing with Marika's mom, who is also here tonight, earlier today, that the words that Marika shares with the students in the classroom carry far more weight than what we do, because Marika lived the program. She's gained the benefits of all of that hard work. And you can see that the students will relate to her much more easily than myself as a teacher, because I'm supposed to ask them to do the work. It's baby steps, baby steps to get them to come through the door. Try the intensive program in the summer, gain benefit there, and then maybe they want to dip their toe into the part-time program over the course of the whole year. So, yeah.
Just the other piece I wanted to add is I have many food allergies, so I cannot eat various things. It's incredibly difficult. It was incredibly difficult to get Will to come to the school, and it was just as hard to get his younger brother to come, even though he knew he saw the benefits of his older brother. It's hard to explain why your brain is not working the way it should, or why you have to work so much harder than maybe your friends. And the way I explained it to our kids is that, well, I just have to work around my allergies. So you have to work around these ideas that you can't do certain things now. But one of the ways of working around that is going to Arrowsmith and trying it. It's just different ways of trying to convince them that this might be a good thing for them, because it's really hard. It's really hard to tell them that this is going to benefit them, but they can't see it for 4 to 6 months. But after that sort of 4 to 6 months piece, it was like the door opened. It was unbelievable. Will plays hockey, and he had auditory processing issues. And there was one day I dropped him off at hockey and I forgot to tell him something. So I sort of yelled at him. I went, oh, he's never going to hear me because he can't hear. And I was yelling through the class, and he had his helmet on, and there was the sounds happening. And this is like 6 to 9 months into the program. He turned around and answered my question. And I couldn't believe it. So it's just perseverance and trying to find different ways of trying to explain why they need to go, because it is so beneficial, and it's hard to understand the cognitive piece. And I was reminded of it this tonight listening to Barbara, that it's starting from the ground up, not the academics piece that I had forgotten. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel for their honest answers tonight, for sharing their insights. Thank you very much. We have a large number of staff here tonight. You'll see us all, not me, others in their Arrowsmith shirts. Please feel free to ask any questions that remain for you, and safe travels home. Thank you very much.